Hi, and welcome to Matt Talk, a video podcast for the friends and family of Coming First United Methodist Church from me, Pastor Matt. Well, maybe you've noticed that since the first Sunday in Advent, we've changed the 11 o'clock order of worship, and we have moved some things around and put some things in different place. We are following the basic pattern of worship that we United Methodists, as well as many other denominations, adopted sometime after the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, that is. And the 8:45 service has already been kind of following this order of worship since we revised it after coming back from the summer break. I wanted to talk with you about why we've changed things around and where we get this from and how we've come about with this. So if you were given a blank sheet of paper and asked to develop a worship service, what would you put in it? And what order would you put those items in? And many times, if we base that on what one prefers or what one likes or what just one seems natural, it works okay until you involve more than one person. And then when you bring other people in, everybody has their own preferences and opinions and ideas about how things should go. And maybe this should go before that, or maybe that should follow after this. Maybe this should be done at the first of the service. Maybe it should be done at the end of the service. And we have lots of opinions and we have a little contention there. So what is the basic order of worship and where do we get it from? And how do we kind of work with that? Well, it actually comes from both scripture as well as historical sources. Hippolytus was the first person in the 4th century to write down the order of worship, and it comes from a very biblical place. And so to keep that historical, theological, and biblical integrity, we follow this basic pattern of worship. So let me share with you where we get this basic pattern of worship from the scriptures. One place is from Luke chapter 24, that familiar story beginning in verse 13 of two disciples who are walking to Emmaus on the day that Jesus has been resurrected. As they begin their journey to Emmaus, they are talking with one another, and they're telling each other about the events of that day, and sharing their hearts and their feelings about what they think about things. And Jesus joins them on that journey. And as he does, he enters into the conversation with them. And he asks them what they're talking about, and they wonder how he could not have possibly heard. And they tell him what's been happening in their lives that day. And we call that kind of, in our basic pattern of worship, the first movement is the entrance. It's where we come into the place of worship and we acknowledge that Christ is with us. Christ even comes into the place also through the acolytes, bringing in the light of the fire. And the fire reminds us of God being the pillar of fire that led the Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land. And it also reminds us of how Jesus said he was the light of the world. And so as the acolytes bring in the fire and light the candles on the altar, and the candles on the altar being two, one reminding of Jesus' humanity, one reminding us of Jesus' divinity, we acknowledge that Christ is here in this place with us, and he's entered into this conversation. That's the entrance as we begin our opening prayers and we begin to converse. The Lord be with you and also with you. And then Jesus, as he was conversing with them, began to explain to them the scriptures, all that had been written about him in Moses and the prophets. And so as Jesus begins to open that up to the disciples, we call that the proclamation and response part of the order of worship. So the first part is the entrance. The second movement is the proclamation and response. And as Jesus explains the scriptures to the disciples, their eyes are kind of open to understanding. And as Jesus starts to go on to the next city, they stop him and invite him to stay with them. That response, their response was to invite him to stay with them. So the proclamation and response. And so Jesus does. And so the next thing they do is they sit down at a table. And as they sit there, Jesus takes bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, and gives the bread. Well, that's our four movements of communion: to take the bread, bless the bread, break the bread, give the bread. I did a sermon not too long ago on that very fact, that anytime you see Jesus do a Eucharistic meal in the scriptures, he always takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, gives the bread. And that's how we do communion as well. We take the bread, we bless the bread with the great thanksgiving. we break the bread and we share the bread with one another. And so Holy Communion is what they do next. And that's our third part of the basic pattern of worship, communion and thanksgiving. And the disciples give thanks for what Jesus has meant to them and how their eyes have been opened and how they felt their hearts kind of warmed when he was talking to them. And then the last part of our basic pattern of worship is ascending forth. And you know what the disciples did when they recognized Jesus? He disappeared from them, but they ran back to Jerusalem from whence they had come, and they began to tell everybody what they had experienced. Most importantly, they shared with everybody how they had experienced the risen Christ through the breaking of bread. So if you look in our United Methodist hymnal on page 3, or actually page 2, we find there the basic pattern of worship. And you'll see that the first movement is the entrance, the second movement is the proclamation and response, followed by the thanksgiving and communion, and lastly, the sending forth. And so we order our worship around those four movements or those four acts of worship. And there's several things that we can put in there, different ways that we respond, different ways we proclaim the scriptures, different ways that we enter, different ways that we may give thanks and all, but we follow this pattern and this basic pattern of worship. So that's why we've kind of turned those things around. The other important thing to know about our worship is that it's always about God speaks first, and then we respond. And so sometimes we come in and the last thing we do is we proclaim the scriptures. But it should be the first thing that we do, is to listen to what it is that God has to say. How is it that Christ wants to talk to us, and what is the message for this day? And then we respond by the giving of our lives, by our prayers. We know now what to pray for. We know now what to give. We know what part of ourselves to offer to Christ because we have first listened. And so there's always a call and response where Jesus talks and we respond. Jesus talks, we listen, and then we respond. And so that also is a very important part of our worship time. The other part I wanted to just bring out to you is that, as United Methodists, we are a very sacramental people. We began as Methodists here in America with the Anglican priests from the Church of England here baptizing children and serving Holy Communion. But when the Revolutionary War began, all the Anglican priests went back to England, and there were no priests here to baptize people, and there were no priests here to serve communion. The sacraments are only done by ordained ministers. And so with no ordained ministers here, the people were starving to death for communion, and they were wanting baptism. Two very important things that sometimes today we take lightly and take for granted, but a very important part of our spiritual journey. It is in the breaking of the bread that our eyes are open. It is in baptism that we remember who we are and hear God proclaim that and promise God's promises to us. So John Wesley, it was the very thing that moved him to break the rules of the Anglican Church and to send Thomas Cokesbury over here to meet Asbury, and for them, the two of them, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, to become the first bishops of Methodism here in America, so that they could then ordain ministers who could then do the sacraments. We already had preachers who could preach, but we didn't have ordained people who could do the sacraments. And so the reason we became a Methodist church here in America is because we needed sacraments, and we needed people to do sacraments. And so we have to remember that our very foundation is sacramental. It was in 1996 at the General Conference that we adopted this holy mystery, and it is the official document of how we understand communion and how we do communion. And in that document, it talks about how we United Methodists are to celebrate Holy Communion every time we meet. We got into the habit of celebrating it just once a month because used to preachers, the ordained clergy on horseback rode around, and sometimes they were here just once a quarter or once a month. And we got into that habit. But we are calling ourselves to come back to, it's a part of worship every Sunday, both word and sacrament. And so hopefully we can begin to move back into that understanding of our worship, that we are here to listen to Christ, we are here to respond, and we're here to have our eyes open as we share this holy sacrament of Holy Communion. And hey, if we don't have time to do anything else, let's just make sure we do the most important things, that we listen and respond, and that we celebrate Holy Communion, that we kind of follow this basic basic pattern of worship in all the times that we do that. And you might want to know that this basic pattern of worship was actually adopted by the United Methodist Church at the 1984 General Conference. So although it is relatively new, it's been around for some time and some years. It just takes us sometimes time to get into it and to live into it. So as we begin to live into it, I hope you will understand it a little bit better, and that this will help you. And hey, check out the front of the United Methodist Hymnal. There's a lot of good information there, and you can see more about this pattern of worship and how it works. So I hope you're enjoying our times of worship, but most important, I hope you're participating, and that together we're doing the work of worship and the work of liturgy, because God is our audience, not us. God is the audience. We are the actors who are doing the act of worship. And the preacher and the choir, well, we're just directing and trying to help us see how we can best worship. And so I hope as we use this pattern of worship, it's a time of directing us and directing our worship, that our worship may be pleasing to God, and that it may certainly be in order that we all agree upon, because it's a historical, theological, and biblical order that keeps that integrity. So it's good to talk with you. I want you to always know how excited I am to be your pastor. And until we meet again, may the peace of Christ always be with you.